money.
Well, we have the amazing Dan Edelstein from London. He was the inspiration for my PhD project, you and Hillary. And so, you very modestly skipped through your achievements, but thanks to your artist-led bank note bonds selling, which were bought up by humble folk like me, but also institutional investors such as the BMA and other big folk like that, you managed to raise about, what was it? It was about £40,000 in the end. Was it a bit more?
That was when we originally started selling them. Yeah, but then we sold quite a lot of bond certificates as well, and we're selling banknotes again now and stuff. So, yeah, but in the original sale we raised 40,000, and then but it's kind of ongoing at the moment just because we've got a film and a book coming out. So we're thinking of like kind of branching out a little bit across Britain to do more debt buying. So we're registering with Financial Conduct Authority at the moment to be able to buy up debt like as a company ourselves. So so it's ongoing. So it is slightly ongoing. Well, it's not really slightly ongoing. It's reaching a kind of, I would imagine it's going to reach a peak in like maybe October, November, December, because we've got the film will come out, we hope, at London Film Festival, and the book is coming out in September. So there's lots of kind of press and everything will be coming out about it soon.
Right.
And then we'll see if there. I mean, there's quite a lot of people around Britain that would like to try it in their town, but they probably don't really have any idea of like how much work it actually is and how much hassle it really is, because it's so much. It really does take over your life trying to do something like that. So on the surface it probably seems really, to many people it probably seems really straightforward. Like you just create a banknote, sell it, and then buy up debt. It sounds like so simple, but actually all the processes are so. They involve so much organization and what's the word for it? You have to get a lot of logistics in play, so it does take quite a long time, and so we'll see. I don't know, but we've registered with Financial Conduct Authority, so if there is a genuine appetite for it across Britain, then we'll see. And I think what would I say to this? So I think it'll get bigger and bigger over the next few months, and then it will kind of we'll see what happens next year.
I think the important thing for people to realise is, even though you raised around £40,000 initially, you managed to write off £1.2 million worth of predatory payday debt for some of the most vulnerable people in London, around the area you live in. I used to live in Walthamstow, and the way you did that was through this extremely clever intervention into this secondary debt market. So you you and Hillary put yourself into the role of what is mostly the shark-infested waters of people who go in and buy up written off debts from the primary lenders like banks, etc. And not even banks really, but often those shopfront payday lenders, which are like a plague in Britain. But then they get written off and they get put onto the secondary debt market, and they get bought up there for a fraction of their original debt price. And so that's how these people make their money. But they nevertheless go off and then they try and collect the full amount of the debt through sending around debt collectors to people's doors, who often just borrowed a few quid because they couldn't afford to meet their bills for that week. And then it becomes a spiralling debt cycle that these people can't get out of, and they're also in a very desperate financial and also psychological place as well. So what Dan and Hillary did is, through £40,000, they bought up 1.2 million worth of payday predatory debt in the local communities. They then sent letters to all the people who owed that, saying, you no longer owe this debt. It's written. And so what they want to do now is to create that as a movement across Britain, because there has been some success with that as an intervention into the economy in the USA. The strike debt movement there, and they're single-handedly doing an artist-led economic intervention, which is incredibly inspiring.
It's a good synopsis. I mean, like, the only thing I'd say to that is just, strike debt, we're arguing, or Professor Andrew Ross, who wrote a book called Creditocracy, was arguing that democracies were being stripped away kind of in a systematic manner, and in their place, creditocracies were taking over, where access to the social and the public good was now being effectively controlled by creditor gatekeepers, so the kind of welfare systems which we saw post Second World War were under a form of systematic attack, really, and I guess really the kind of the free market ideology had taken over, where forms of public, what had been decided were public good, were now being being exposed to the market forces, and as a result of that, mixed with falling real incomes, more and more people were just sliding into personal debt, and Ross argued as well that was kind of like a form of control. So I don't know if you guys can hear me, because it sounds like there's waves crashing.
I think Nick, you're doing something. Can people just who aren't speaking, can they just put mute on your the mute thing? Yeah, that's it. That's all. I'm hearing people rustle about. Damn. Sounds of Melbourne.
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Anyway, I probably finished. I was just like going on and on about Andrew Ross, but I think he's great because Andrew Ross was one of the founding members of Strike Debt, along with Laura Hanna and who else? A couple of other interesting. Astro Taylor. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's who I was looking for in my mind. But he was able to articulate it really, I feel, best as to how what that movement was trying to do in that book Creditocracy, that you can get from All Books, which is an imprint which I think it's a New York-based publisher, but I have the feeling they sell a lot in England. You can probably get them in Australia as well. But it's a fantastic book to read, because it sort of removed the shackles from my eyes, if you like, about what was. I never sort of felt like I understood economics. I always felt it was something sort of slightly separate from lived human experience, it was a real eye-opener. And so Andrew Ross was brilliant. And then a kind of companion philosopher, if you like, is David Graeber, who also who wrote a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and is also credited with coming up with that phrase, the 1% or the 99, that we are the 99%, I think. So connected to Occupy, and he's now in London. And his book is brilliant as well for just sort of for just exposing the sort of hypocrisy around the morality of debt, and how debts for large corporations and the very wealthy and the banks are always up for renegotiation, but it's the debts of the people at the bottom who which are continually enforced, through the law, the apparatus of law and state. And so that was, I guess that was the kind of basis of that those types of books and ideas were the kind of philosophical underpinnings and of the project that we ended up doing. And also, Strike Debt had bought up millions of dollars of student and medical debt in America. So we were just interested to see if that's something that we could do in Britain. But really, I guess the project, our project and theirs kind of diverged, not in terms of our moral compass or our analysis, but just in terms of like the way we executed it, because they basically got donations from all over the place, but like we ended up creating a kind of metaphor of a bank that worked in reverse, you know, rather than indebting people, the bank itself would do its best to liberate people from the shackles of the finance industry, because we were looking particularly around the kind of concept of how banks create money from thin air by giving out loans, and how when those loans are repaid, the actual money disappears, you know, which is kind of like this crazy, perverse reality, you know. And obviously they say they create 10 grand, but they take out 11,000 in terms of the full amount plus their interest. It means that weirdly, as more and more money is created, more and more wealth is being extracted. So you continually end up with what it reminds me of a game of like, you know, that thing where, you know, that children play when you're running around and you have to find a chair to sit on, and there's always one more chair removed, and there's so basically by
musical
the structure,
chairs.
musical chairs, by the structure of the way banks create money, there's never going to be enough to repay them, you know. So there will always be casualties, you know, within this kind of fiat system, and within this kind of explosion of this deregulation of banks. Anyway, I'm so sorry because I'm just going on and on. I think you should take it back.
That's all. It seems like we'll be doing things a little bit in reverse now. We're going to have this open discussion, and after our two main speakers. But I'm so glad you've joined. You've kind of been joined our list of speakers now, Dan. Very, very. As you wake up in London, inadvertently. But I guess you're used to that now. But it's kind of a good segue, because I think you're approaching debt and credit from that systemic impact on the individuals, and the individual and the household's relationship to bank, and the household's relationship to individual debt. But what Emma Dawson was going to speak to us about as our first speaker, and I think I may as well just kick this formally off now. We've got 26 participants. I do feel a bit heartbroken, because we had 60 people enrolling who have all now been told that the meeting is kicking them out. But hopefully some people might brave it and try and join nevertheless. But I think maybe we may as well just kick off formally, and then we'll continue pick up some of the threads. So you introduce Dan later after we can from Emma, and then we've heard from Rebecca. If that's okay. Yeah. So I'll just do a quick intro for people who don't know Emma. So Emma is the CEO, the Executive Director of Per Capita, which is a progressive think tank here in Australia. And she has done many things in her life. She publishes articles and opinion pieces on a wide range of public policy issues, which are here in some of the major dailies here, including the Australian Financial Review. And Dan and I actually noticed that things are getting so far to the right in England that even the Financial Times in the UK is starting to look progressive in some of its commentary by comparison to what's going on. There's some interesting commentators there. And so Emma's kind of our equivalent here in Australia. And so Emma also is a regular panellist on a very popular TV series here called The Drum on ABC TV. And she also does some Sky News programs. Very distinguished set of credentials academically. She's got an MA from Monash. She's on the board of the Prader-Willi Research Foundation in Australia, an honorary fellow at the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. But most importantly of all, I think, for us, is that Emma is a La Trobe alumni. Yes. She holds a BA with first class honours from drama, philosophy and screen studies. Yes. Exactly the areas that I believe the Morrison government has recently announced a doubling of fees for, and I hold Emma partly to blame for this, because you can see by Emma's achievements that studying these kinds of subjects simply turns you into a dull, bludgeoning troublemaker. Emma's going to talk about, I demolish, I believe, a favourite myth promoted by neoliberalism both here and in the UK, which is that austerity is good for the economy. And underpinning this myth is another finance myth, which is that government debt is exactly the same as household debt, i.e. we cannot, indeed, we should not live beyond our means. And so do you want to kick off discussion today? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this. It's terrific to talk to artists. I once intended to be one of you. I was going to be an actress, but then, you know, Kate Blanchett happened, and there was no coming back from that. But I did study drama, theatre studies, screen and philosophy at La Trobe in the early 90s, and did my honours year in 96. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here in St Kilda, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I am the executive director of Per Capita, which is a very small, quite bolshy think tank based in Melbourne. We are sort of well to the left even of the Grattan Institute, I would say, and certainly have a focus on fighting inequality and promoting social justice. I've been in this role now for coming on to 4 years, but I was involved in kicking off Per Capita in the late noughties, the 2007, as a group of volunteers that came together and wanted to set up someone that could hit back at the IPA, and that's what we try to do. Nicole got in touch after some recent publications that we did around the issue of debt and deficit, and this ridiculous, you know, neoliberal idea that governments are constrained and should be as small as possible and get out of the way and let the market take care of everything, and that's a very efficient way for everybody to have a better life, because as we all know, that is, and if I can be profane, bullshit. The market has singularly failed to support most people certainly in developed nations. It's free trade and globalisation has done something to lift developing countries out of poverty, although the recent report from the UN Rapporteur on Inequality has suggested, I think quite convincingly, not nearly as much as free market proponents like to say it has. But it's certainly disrupted the bonds of community. It's destroyed and deliberately set out to destroy the public sphere, public services. Things like the ABC are constantly, and the BBC in the UK as well, constantly under threat, in the pursuit of privatisation, the marketisation of every relationship, and the ability for a few people who are very well off and control all of the capital to make more and more profits out of what were previously seen as essential services. And the arts are a huge casualty of that. Creative practice, anything that isn't seen as immediately contributing to the bottom line and can be quantified by a very strict and very constrained series of measurements is dismissed by that ideology. And we've seen that in Australia, as Nicole alluded to, throughout this crisis, in a refusal to include universities in the stimulus, in the JobKeeper package and so on, changes to higher education policy that have tripled fees and costs for humanities. As Nicole said, that's because they don't like bolshy people like me learning how to think and criticise them, I think, more than anything else. And things like cuts to the ABC, cuts to the CSIRO, and effectively, really at a time when I would say even more in Australia than in the UK, bizarrely, at the moment. And I'm from the UK originally, so I follow English politics very closely. I'm from Rochdale, home of the cooperative movement. We have seen a quite an ideological approach to this stimulus that has really preferenced tradies and very masculine ideas of the economy, very patriarchal structures, has looked to prop up business rather than people, has looked to prop up shares and the value of assets rather than income and jobs. And so I think we are at a turning point in our public engagement, in our history. This is an epoch-defining era. So if you have knowledge of the history of political economy, there is strong evidence that eras tend to last for about 80 years, and that there are cycles that occur in human relations that mean there is a reset, and that's what we're facing now. I would argue that we were facing it before COVID. The GFC happened, nothing really changed. We're facing an existential crisis of climate change and the biggest increase in inequality between capital and labour that we've seen for the better part of a century. In a way, it's almost fatalistic to say, well, this is Mother Nature striking back and saying, listen, you guys aren't paying attention. We sent you a GFC. We sent you all of these. And GFC is the term we use to refer to the global financial crisis of 2008, by the way, for our UK participants, because we didn't actually go into technical recession. But we sent you all these things and you weren't listening. So here's a freaking virus that you're going to have to take seriously. And I think it is our last best chance to reset the structure of our economy and our society so that it no longer operates in the interests of a few wealthy individuals, but returns to being a focus on sustainability, shared prosperity, and a reduction in inequality. As we were talking about while we were setting up, and I was enjoying listening to you all, particularly to Daniel and others, that many of the achievements in the UK and Australia following the Great Depression and the Second World War that saw the emergence of the welfare state have been deliberately eroded over time by the neoliberal project. And so they have sought deliberately to chip away at the foundations of those very important social structures. And they've done so in a way that has convinced people that they're doing it in their best interest. Whereas, of course, that's not the case. So, with that ramble out of the way, to get to the point on debt, particularly to start with the debt and deficit narrative, it's something that has become so well absorbed and so successfully proselytised by the right over the last few decades that ordinary people who have no assets, other than perhaps the house they hold a mortgage over, if they're lucky enough, to believe that a government debt is a bad thing, that running a deficit budget is a terrible demonstration of economic illiteracy by our leaders, and that they have some interest in seeing government debt be reduced. Effectively, the right has convinced people that public debt is like household debt, and that if you can't pay it off in a certain amount of time, then you'll go bankrupt and lose your asset. To which my question is, what's the asset? We understand when we take out a mortgage on a house that if we don't make the repayments, we'll lose the house. You can't lose your country. You can't lose your economy. You can't lose your people. So government effectively can and does issue money. I'm not on the same page as some of the more extreme modern monetary theorists that say that we don't have to worry at all about that. We do have to have some fiscal responsibility so that we don't see massive amounts of inflation and instability in the economy. But there's nothing to constrain a government, particularly in a time of recession, in effectively printing money and pumping it into the economy. We are not at risk any time in the foreseeable future of an inflation breakout that would see the price of goods and services go up to such a degree that people can no longer afford them. And we haven't been in that position for at least the last 12 years. So that kind of narrative that we must tightly control government spending and everything is better done by the market has actually led to a situation now where people are in insecure work, their wages are failing to keep pace with the real cost of living, and there is absolutely no correlation now between the levels of and underemployment and insecure employment and the way that the economy performs. We have been convinced that we should be more concerned about balancing the budget than balancing the economy. And most of us do not benefit from a growth in gross domestic product or in the terms of international trade. We experience the economy in our own lives by, have we got a job? Are we getting paid a decent amount, a decent rate of pay? Are we able to keep a roof over our heads, look after ourselves and enjoy a slightly increasing standard of living? And I would add to that, obviously, that growth now for growth's sake and growth at the expense of sustainability is clearly no longer a possibility, and we need to rediscover the way that we interact with ourselves and with our planet in a way that redistributes prosperity more fairly, but also more sustainably. So hitting back at that narrative is hard, and Nicole mentioned that I now have a monthly column in the Australian Financial Review, which is, a very conservative finance paper here in Australia. And I've had some people say, why are you writing in the Fin Review? Well, I managed to sneak some Marxist economic theory into my article for them last week, and it got through to publication. So you've just got to be really canny about how you do this stuff. But I think it's really important to start having those arguments to people that, it's no point just preaching to the converted all the time. And really disrupting that narrative around, it's better if the government is in surplus, because that shows strong economic management. Actually, if the government's in surplus, the private sector's in debt. It's a balancing of the economy. And in Australia, one of the issues we have is that we have relatively low public debt by international standards, but we have sky-high household debt. So household debt in Australia is at over 200% of annual income. So that means everybody owes more than 200 times, more than twice what they earn in a year and it's primarily due to the inflation of housing prices. So our economy and our sort of mythical 3 decades of growth until this recession were based on two things: unsustainable housing costs and land costs, and immigration, which is not a bad thing. Immigration is a good thing. It's made our nation much stronger and more diverse and more welcoming, but it's also tended to mask at the headline level that people's living standards, including new immigrants and older immigrants, and all of us, unless we're First Nations Australians, are immigrants within a few generations in Australia. Living standards have been stagnant or going backwards. So a lot of these myths that we're told about how well the economy is doing are so pervasive. And one of the reasons I think that people here and in the UK with Brexit and in America with Trump have become so enamoured of the kind of demagogue and the radical drain the swamp, upending of the system, is because they're told repeatedly that everything's fine and that we're growing and that we're doing well, but they feel themselves that they're not. They know themselves that they're not. And so their anger then is targeted very cleverly by the same right-wing proponents to say, well, don't look up, don't get angry at Rupert Murdoch, get angry at the immigrant that's taking your job, get angry at the woman that's entered the workforce and taken a man's job. So it's a very effective and divisive way of effectively getting control of wealth and assets and extracting all the wealth from our economy and shoveling it up to the top. We should have been having this argument 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, but there's a saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is today. And so it is incumbent on all of us, I think, at this moment in time to really grasp what is an unusual opportunity when people think everything's up in the air now. Life as we know it has changed massively. We don't know what's coming. This is an opportunity to make things better. The role of creative people and of artists in doing that, I think, is really underappreciated by the broader economy. If you want to understand how that mythology of individualism, free market capitalism has taken hold around the world, it's primarily through American television. It's through the stories that we tell one another. And one of the reasons I think I get asked to do a lot of media and talking about economics and others is because I was originally trained as a storyteller. I was trained as an actress and a writer. And so I am able to sort of connect those stories. And the reason that that narrative has been so widespread and so accepted amongst ordinary people is not because of economics textbooks or think tanks or politicians. It's because the portrayal of that mythology that if you just work hard you'll get ahead has been so pervasive, particularly in American Hollywood and television production for the last 40 or 50 years, that it has seeped into the consciousness as just the way things are. And so the role of artists to all tell stories, whether it's through music, through visual art, through drama, through writing, through any form of art, it's a form of storytelling, is absolutely critical to how we start to shift that narrative. narrative. So it's terrific to be talking to the people that effectively do have such influence, and subtle influence, and often unseen influence on how people relate to the world. Is that what you wanted me to do, Nicole? Is that okay?
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I just want you to write my thesis now, thanks. Hope you don't charge too much.
I never finished my own PhD, so I wouldn't be asking you for help.
No, a lot of really salient points, which I'll actually come back to a bit later. Particularly, I read in The Age or somewhere about a week or so ago about how the economy, thank goodness we can all relax a bit, because projections are that GDP won't be hit so bad. The economy is actually going to do pretty well. And it's going to do pretty well because there are these indicators on the share market and things like that. You know, the shareholders
the jobs.
How to get. And then the same space, it was like, we're also facing mass unemployment.
Yeah. There was a Deloitte.
Don't worry. The economy is going really, really well. You know, so
there was a Deloitte report, right? And it said the economy is going to bounce back, but jobs and incomes aren't. How did we sleepwalk into a world where our measure of success is completely removed from the lives of the people that drive our life, that build, that work and build and do things? You know,
yes.
Why does it matter whether the share market's booming and GDP figures are great if everybody's unemployed and broke? You know, it's just completely nonsense.
It was really extreme, that, and then you picked up on that in the financial review. I saw you picked up on that, and I was just like, yeah. But that goes to the heart of whose economy is it anyway, and how is it an economy defined, and what isn't an economy? And that is where Rebecca Conroy this is part of her mission in life, is to question, to raise those very questions. And I'll introduce you now, if that's okay, Beck.
Sure.
Our second speaker is, sorry, I'm a little bit discombobulated because of the Eventbrite. And I thank you, Kim, for saying that was a capitalist conspiracy theory, that Eventbrite won't let people into this event. You could well be right there. So I'm just finding your bio there, Beck. This is very modest bio.
Yeah, I sent you the really short one because no one wants to hear you bang on about yourself, I feel.
Oh, I'd like to bang on about you, if that doesn't sound a little bit rude. But the straight story is Beck is an interdisciplinary artist and researcher working across sites, community engagement and performative interventions through artist-led activity. She's presented work in a range of art institutions and performances across Australia and internationally. Her latest suite of works are focused around interventions across art and economy. Her most recent work, which is how I came across Beck, is in the Marrickville School of Economics, which she pretty much single-handedly founded in 2016.
And 27.
1833, brings together artists and non-artists to learn about ways to reconfigure and reinvigorate the design and intentions of economy. And I think you're going to speak, Beck, about a piece you wrote a couple of years ago, which is a wonderfully thought-provoking manifesto on what an artist-led economy might look like, and which goes right to the heart of what is an economy and whose economy is it. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nicole. Thank you for that introduction that I wrote. And also thank you to Emma for that energetic, I feel energized. I was starting to kind of, you know, I'm traveling at the moment in a camper van. Thanks to COVID, my industry, the two industries I work for, academia and the arts, my sources of income were pretty smashed. And so I decided to become a homeowner, and I did that terrible thing which no one should be doing, which is withdrawing your superannuation to cover. But basically the situation for me was working as an artist in Australia is super difficult at the best of times, but it's particularly difficult at the moment. But before I go any further, yes, I want to acknowledge that the land that I'm zooming in from is from the Gummingea people, which is near, it's in the Clarence River, which is kind of inland mid-north coast, I guess. For those who know New South Wales, it's almost to Queensland, basically. So it's a little bit warmer, slightly warmer up here, which is great. So Emma, you were talking about narratives, and I just want to first preface talking about working with artists or talking about arts and economy, which has been kind of what I've been doing for the last 5 years. It's always really difficult to communicate what the arts does, because that's its beauty, because it's such an intangible beast that its magic is that it can be contained, but just as soon as you contain it or define it, it will hemorrhage out or bleed into another form, or shapeshift, which is what's great about it, but does make it tricky to kind of quantify it or point to its kind of value. But in fact, the arts have been valued and have had the metrics done so much. There's been so many reports done. I feel like I know more about the value of the arts and its contribution to the economy than I know about lots of other things I'd prefer to know about the arts. And I feel like the situation for the arts in Australia and likewise elsewhere, although I feel like it's particularly acute here, it doesn't seem to matter. The dismissal of the arts isn't necessarily about its contribution to the economy. I think that's well known, but is, as you said, Emma, it's the hostility is ideological. So there is this real kind of it feels like there's a war going on with the arts, and you can also include the humanities in that. And I guess the role that arts play in critical thinking, the kind of expansion of the mind to get you to think about things differently is probably what's most threatening about it. And the irony, I guess, for me, I work in interdisciplinary practice, and the work that I do is always super difficult to explain. In fact, as I'm going through regional towns in New South Wales at the moment, the number of conversations I've had about, oh, you're an artist, what sort of art do you do? I always, I wonder whether or not to have the conversation, because it feels like the general kind of literacy about the arts is at a bit of a low in Australian society broadly, I think. And I think that's, can be explained by the kind of the culture wars that have been going on in this country. So there's a very skewed understanding about the ecosystem of the arts, like how does it function? How does it work? What value is it contributing? How is it helping society? How is it valuable? So I feel like that's already a tough conversation. And then my practice is experimental. It's often called social practice or socially engaged practice. It's interventionist, it's site-based. So these are a lot of words that, people, they're not consuming those, those ideas on a regular basis. I suppose you could say that they were very privileged discourses, or, nuanced discourses. But the work, I think it is really important. And ironically, I think how I became interested in working at that intersection of art and economy was because I was flabbergasted by the ability of the spin doctors, or the kind of, mythologizing around the economy was being, I thought, oh my God, they're better storytellers than us. In theatre, you have this idea of the suspension of disbelief, which allows you to occupy a theatre space, an auditorium, but at the same time to imagine that you're, somewhere else, like a fabricated mise en scene. And you do that with an agreement with the audience. Everyone can agree to suspend their disbelief, to imagine that that's the location of the scene in the play, the story. And it feels like economists and politicians have been able to do that quite well. And so I kind of started thinking about this role reversal of economists starting to, tell fictions and tell stories. And artists, meanwhile, were increasingly being told, at least in Australia, to be better business managers, to make sure that you know, validate your worth, make sure that you're maximizing, you know, your box office. And, you know, artists have become very good business managers, in particular, trying to, you know, write grants. In fact, one of the most insulting things was, you know, whilst money was given out to business during COVID, the rescue packages, the arts didn't get any. But when it did come, it was 250 million, which is nothing, which mostly goes to the top end of town. So the engine room of the arts, the independent artists, completely being sidelined. But then included in that were a bunch of loans and grants that we had to apply for, which was like, oh my God. So I guess there was a bunch of that sort of, you know, frustration and kind of curiosity about, you know, what is this, you know, like literally fictitious capital, and thinking about money. And I love the project, with the People's Bank that you did, Dan. I did look at that project when I was kind of doing a little tour of the UK a couple of years ago. And yeah, those kinds of projects that kind of Trojan horse, you know, occupy those sites of exchange and then take them to that act them out, or that take them to the extreme. You know, that's pretty much my practice. And I love doing works that are kind of provocative like that. And so that's kind of a little bit of background stuff. I don't know if that helps to contextualize what I'm about to talk about, which is, I was asked to give a talk in Sydney, and I'd been kind of, I guess, marinating a couple of ideas around an artist-led economy, because I got so frustrated with, I don't want to be the square peg in the round hole. I don't want to fit into your business model. This business model sucks for everyone. These ideas that circulate about the economy, it's not just that artists have a problem trying to comply with the value and the metrics, but for everyone, it's a terrible set of ideas when you think about it. Like, I always call it, it's just really terrible design. So I started thinking through, you know, what if you designed the economy based on the kind of principles of being an artist? Because I do feel like being an artist is the most financially insane thing to do. I mean, it goes against, it's got a particular logic to it that I think defies, that in itself is anti-capitalist. And it's not a gesture of charity. It's not for any of those kind of, you know, moral high horses. It's just the logic of making art just is essentially anti-capitalist in its essence. So I went through a bunch of ideas that kind of, if we worked from the idea of what it's like to, what would be conducive to an artist, if the economy was created around the ideas and the principles of the artist. So I'll just go through what those ideas are. So first of all, I asked us a couple of questions about, I looked at what are the specific elements of the conventional business model in the arts that don't work for the arts. Like, I examined all the things that were just completely useless for us, that are just inappropriate. And then looked at what is it that independent artists or artists in the small to medium sector do well when we organize our own production and our distribution of goods. So what is it that's innately, you know, inherently economic in the work that we do? And then how do we talk about that? How do we talk about that particular language? I mean, that particular process of production and distribution. Like, what is, so rather than reverting to the kind of measurements and you know, financial grammar of the world, but looking at, you know, the kinds of ways we talk about production and how they relate to our relationships, how they relate to well-being, how they're really important to the kind of they're considerations that make it, that are essential if you want to keep creating work. So a different kind of economic logic. And then I ask myself the question, who is making decisions, who is speaking for artists and arts workers? And is their decision making informed by practice? So trying to look at like practice as a kind of driving force for how that decision making structure should be designed. So a practice-led approach. And then I started sketching out those ideas. So I'm just going to go through them because, I just want to say on that last point that the last thing about the ideas around an economy, I think the decision-making governance structure is really important to be tethered to the bodies that are impacted by the decisions. Like a lot of the economic models and decision-making has such a gap between the people who make the decisions and those who are affected by the consequences. So looking at, pulling into the middle those who are going to actually be affected by and whose knowledge is most, central. So the first thing about an artist-led economy, or how it would behave, is that it recognizes that it's interdependent. So interdependence is a key part of the labor, the social. These are all kind of conflated. They're all working together, and they're messy. They're not neat and tidy. They're messy, and they're completely bound up in reproducing each other. So there's a kind of imbrication at work. The economy of the artist is relational, and in the sense that I use the example of the bee produces honey, but this is a byproduct of what its real function is, which is to pollinate. So the artist economy works better when it's considered as a conduit and a fertilizer of relations, rather than a product like an art thing or an art object. Certainly we've had enough of art history being dominated by that concept. It's governed by movement. Movement is really crucial to the artist economy. It's processual, it's in flux, and it flows. And we don't necessarily like to capture, we don't capture ideas, we momentarily apprehend them, but we flourish when we keep passing that gift on. So if we keep that gift in circulation. So, creative collaboration doesn't work without that idea. It's indeterminate. So it's in a constant process of becoming and unbecoming. We understand that things are constantly forming and that things are constantly in flux, and that this is the very condition that allows creativity to happen. It's open source. Ideas and knowledge grow best through sharing. Mutual aid. We consider the contributions we make according to the values that we decide on. So there's a consensus of decision in that, or an agency. And it's also, the economy of the artist is very much a spectrum, and is very non-binary, in the sense that we're constantly moving across a spectrum, and the idea of a static binary is kind of the logic of cancer. And so the binaries are there, but they are constantly differentiating. This is a common principle that's shared across, prison abolition and mental health consumers. But I thought it was important to say nothing about us without us. So once again, artists talking about economy, we have to get our hands dirty with it. We have to be in decision-making roles. Something I alluded to earlier, practice-led. The shape of our production and distribution is shaped by the practice and the needs of those who practice it. And particular to Australia, but also to other colonized lands, custodianship and stewardship as models of ownership, where there is, this is in Australia, First Nations, Torres Strait Islanders, you can't own the land, you can only belong to the land. So that's, I think, a concept that marries well. And the last two is anti-monopoly. That this idea that ideas can replicate, and that if you give your idea to someone else and see what they do to it, rather than a kind of franchise model. And the final one is a few things jammed together: generative, not reductive, abundance, not scarcity, and distribution and accumulation. Distribution, not accumulation. So I think all of those three are kind of generally related together. And so, you know, that's it. They're all the ideas. And obviously some of them are quite general and some of them are quite particular to the situation for artists in terms of producing. But I think given the paucity of imagination within the economic field, I feel like there is a lot that artists could contribute to the thinking. And I think it's only fair given how much influence the business world has had on the arts world. So it would be good to see a little bit of, you know, give and take there. That's it.
Wow, that's amazing.
Did I go over too long? Did I talk too long? Because I actually lost track of the time.
No, there is nothing.
Apologies if I did. Sorry.
I'll mark you down on your performance.
Well, you know, it's all about
it's all
equal
about
distribution of time.
That's right. No, that was fantastic. So there was a huge amount of food for thought, and if people go up in the chat screen, I did post. I cut and pasted a lot of the ideas that manifesto, I should say, that Beck's been talking to in a document. I put it up on my events website, and as I did with the per capita debt paper, myth-busting paper. And if you want to take time to absorb all that, I encourage you to go back up the chat and go to my website and download those papers and have a look at them. I also had a couple of crazy ideas myself, which I put up there, which we might come to at the very end of our discussion. But gosh, so I loved I loved what you said about how, and it was a link with Emma's agenda as well, which is how certain people, certain elites, financial elites, have managed to monopolize our imaginations and have become very good storytellers and myth tellers, and that's become dominant across so many spheres of culture. And we just, because we seem to, you know, we've allowed that to become the stories that we somehow believe, either consciously or unconsciously. I was wondering if Emma, you wanted to make another comment about that, or indeed Dan, because some of the thinkers that Dan has introduced me to were talking about something called the financialization of the imagination, about how so much of our thinking has been, in many cases, quite unconsciously, absorbed many of these largely spurious neoliberal economic ideas about what prosperity is, what economy is, and even how we should act as people, and how we should measure our own value as people. So I'm just throwing that one out there if anyone would like to comment.
Dan, you go first. I had a good run. I'll jump in.
I wasn't sure if you wanted me or Emma to reply to that, because I mean, it's such a deep, I mean, all of the, by the way, that was great. I loved listening to both Emma and Rebecca there. It was really interesting and quite moving, actually, to hear another artist, you know, on the other side of the world articulate feelings which we have, like, on a daily basis about culture and art workers effectively being under attack, in which kind of answers your question, Nicole, I think, which I'm sure you agree with as well, about how our imaginations are effectively, I suppose that we need to kind of imagine ourselves as mini kind of businesses all the time, don't we? And so in other words, we're continually wondering how we can market ourselves, you know, and increase our bottom line, in the same way that everyone else is, having to think about things. And also the fact that there are always effectively two kind of art markets in operation within any country. There is the kind of independent, ideas driven art, and then there is the kind of commodity market of paintings, etc., which I think probably Rebecca was the kind of, when you go around to these towns in New South Wales and you say you're an artist, and then everyone immediately wonders what your paintings must look like or whatever, or if you've got any postcards available or that type of thing. The concept that art is something that should hang on a wall, or adorn. And weirdly, like we also find this within the realms of the politicians, the people who are articulating ideas that we find exciting, even the funders, in fact, who say that they want to fund things which are culturally adventurous, or which challenge, prevailing neoliberal ideas, often actually don't want to take any risk at all with their art. They're completely, what's the word? I don't want to make this sound awful, but their ability to articulate what art is often quite stunted as well. Because I think in the education system, art is hugely underplayed right from the age of 5 or 6. Like our children, they studied art at nursery, and then they had a year or two of it at school, and then after that it's pretty much cut from the curriculum, and it's the first thing to go from our local primary school. As soon as the cuts started coming in, it was the art teachers who lost out, that they immediately got rid of. So there's a systematic undervaluing of I think creativity, that starts early, and seems to be getting, more and more, of an onslaught. So I think that the imagination effectively is encouraged towards those areas of the economy which, it seems to be like central is numeracy, which of course is important, but this idea of measuring things through numbers, and also, the kind of English, getting people maybe ready to take notes and be good secretaries, of the future and that type of thing. So yeah, I do think that we're effectively encouraged to be obedient, basically, in one way or another. And I think that goes for artists as well. Like, if you're going to be an artist, at least be an obedient artist, who launches a sensible career and becomes very good at one thing which is quite difficult, and then employs a marketing system which maximizes the bottom line, et cetera, et cetera. And perversely, we've had to become really quite skilled at marketing in order to try and build, an audience, and to be able to retain an audience and grow it and monetize it and all the rest of it. So we have to carry within us contradictions, while I actually see Rebecca and feel, and agree with everything that you say, I also, when I'm watching and listening, I'm aware that I am carrying a contradiction, which is that actually every single day, we're generating, we have to generate sales, all the time, to build all that.
I hear you. It's a interesting, paradox, but just as an example of that, trying to resolve an attempt to resolve that in the Marrickville School of Economics, which is an artist-led pedagogy, as Nicole introduced it earlier. It actually, the byline is learning ways to unfuck the economy is actually, but I thought I'd be more polite and say reconfigure. But we decided at the end of that last module that we just finished, that we would abolish the art system, that we just wanted to abolish art. And that was the best thing that we could do, is just to destroy art and just start again, because it feels so contaminated, and it does feel like it's so obedient now. And it does feel like the more radical things, like the kind of, you know, financial cowboys in the kind of speculative market can do more radical things than artists these days, and that is fucked up and wrong. You know, like there's some really skewed inverse logic that seems to be happening, I think. So yes, we should all be bankers.
So I just there's got to be a word for this in Urban Dictionary, which is one has subscribed to far too many activist, progressive, very well-meaning, like mail-list, etc. So you're constantly getting deluged with stuff. But one of them is a campaign for tax justice in the US, and the unbelievable news there is that billionaires have grown. There's been more billionaires thanks to COVID over the last few months than there were before. There's about 600 or so to start with, but there's more now. And but then the point that I think you made with then what happens is that some of these people, because they've got so much ill-gotten gains, are able to have more of an impact with their money than we can through our gestures, through our gestures and stuff. But Emma, you're on the telly, and you've had a background in storytelling, and so what would you think, like in terms of is there a TV stories, is there a TV series or something that can be done that would sort of be able to take your debt paper, for example, and turn it into something that can be enjoyed, entertained, infotainment?
Look, I'd like to think so. I think one of the challenges we have is actually the Australian media is incredibly conservative, even compared to the UK. And that's
not so sure about that.
But you know, there are programs made in the UK. For example, there's a program made about Brexit recently. I can't imagine a kind of critical drama made about recent political developments in this country. It would be incredibly polarising. But I do think that this is the kind of thing that we need to do to cut through. And there are still some options for doing that. SBS is still a little bit more bold and brave in that regard than certainly than the commercials and even the ABC. But a lot of the streaming services now as well. I think if we were to sort of say, well, could we tell the kind of story? The fantastic series that and the name of it escapes me at the moment, but it was that very futuristic UK with Emma Thompson.
Black Mirror.
No, not Black Mirror.
No, the election she was elected. You know,
yeah.
It's a future scenario with Emma Thompson.
Years and years.
That's it. Yeah. That kind of thing, which screened on SBS here, you know, and it really only preached to the converted. But it was the last episode was a little weird, but it was a really compelling sort of look at how the decisions we make have this accumulative effect that lead us to a place where we really don't want to be. And it was also not that far-fetched now, given what's going on in the UK and the US. I think something along those lines would be quite compelling for an Australian audience, but it's a matter of how you get something like that up in our current environment, particularly given that, you know, the cuts to Screen Australia funding, to ABC funding, to drama commissioning across the board. But I was
going to say, it's like the worst time ever to be producing work on screen-based work is like, it's dire in terms of Australian content. It's never been worse.
And the commercials now, of course, and I should flag here that I did 5 years as a stint as an advisor to the communications minister in the Rudd and Gillard governments, Stephen Conroy, which people find bizarre because he's really right-wing Labor and I'm really left. But I was focused on public broadcasting and screen and drama content, and you know, we managed to defend those quotas that were under attack from the commercial sector for a long time, but we're really in danger of losing that now. And we have a government that's very sympathetic towards saying, well, why it doesn't matter that we tell our own stories? You know, we're an English-speaking country, we can just get everything from Netflix. So I do think there needs to be, you know, a strong voice saying, actually telling these stories is really important, and pushing back against that idea that everybody just wants to watch, you know, The Bachelor or Does the Farmer Have a whatever those. I don't watch those programs, so I don't know the names of them. Although I do watch The Voice because I've got a 6-year-old, as you probably just saw. So, you know, how do we do that? And particularly with the kind of loss of community television and other outlets for that kind of storytelling, there needs to be a real push in that direction. And I think perhaps it's time to think a little bit more creatively about how we harness the multinationals, how we say, well, maybe Netflix would do this show for us. You know, they've done some more cutting edge and more creative stuff. And there's certainly the benefit there is that they're very, they're making huge inroads to a younger audience. And my one point of optimism is that the kids seem to be all right? They've the younger people today. I'm Gen X, and my generation was just terribly apathetic. Whereas the people coming up behind me seem, I think, through necessity, as having no job security, no ability to buy a home, have become as radicalized as those of us that were really sort of left wing in my generation. So Netflix cuts through those people. So maybe that's an avenue.
Can I just respond to that? Because we've just finished, or we're in the process of finishing our film, which is Bank Job, which we got BFI funding for in Britain, and we are working with the producer of Margin Call. You know, the American. It's an American film about the 2008 crash, to try and get the film into America, but we've been. I mean, we think the film is really it's speaking about this financialization in a very clear way, because it's telling the story of the bank job and strike debt and the way everyone's getting indebted, and you know it's quite clear on all of that stuff. So it's informative, but we've been told by Channel 4 that they wouldn't find an audience for it. We've also been told by Netflix that it won't work for their audience last week. And actually, I think it really speaks of you. I think you think possibly that, Emma, that somehow Britain is less conservative in its storytelling desires than Australia. However, our producer in Britain has been in independent filmmaking and public broadcasting for about 30 years. And he describes the exact same trajectory within filmmaking and television as what we're talking about within the kind of financialization of everything. There's less and less space for independent voices on British television, for sure. And really hard to find space for the critical imagination on British television. That is the truth of it. Although it's cool that you picked up. It's cool that you picked up that there's that side. There's a desire and a hunger for maybe science fiction where these ideas can be kind of safely discussed and put out there. But it seems to be quite hard to find, space for, anything that deals with politics or which challenges the prevailing viewpoint, that effectively everything's okay, with at least within documentaries. I accept that, Daniel. I think the trajectory is exactly the same. I think you were starting from a better position than us, though. We've always been quite myopic, and we're a small country, right? There's not nearly as much budget or creative capacity in a population of 24 million. So no, but absolutely the trajectory is similar. Yeah, well, it's just one of those things. But fingers crossed, we're hopeful that we'll find somehow. I mean, so the way this works, it seems to us, is that within our sphere is that we have to try and get to film festivals to start with, and then to try and, we will hopefully sell it into some, maybe in America to PBS or something like that. but I mean, I know because I was talking a minute ago, Rebecca, about the marketing, having to learn how to do marketing. We've had 1 million views of the bank job trailer on Facebook, you know, and huge engagement. And why wouldn't there be? There's 8.8 million people on the edge of personal bankruptcy in Britain before the coronavirus came along. So the subject of where all this debt is coming from is of huge interest to massive amounts of people. You know, there's a hunger for the story. So then the question is, well, why is it that the broadcasters are effectively so risk averse? I just don't know. Is it an ideological position, or is it just that
I think it reflects the idea that once again, you know, artists should be in control of distribution platforms, you know, like we should also be in that world. And I'm really excited about, you know, a number of, if you look at the kind of digital platform co-ops that have started around artist-owned versions of Spotify, or for example, Stocksy is a photographer's network and platform that basically takes the idea of Shutterstock. So when you go to look for a stock image, instead of going to a platform that is owned by shareholders and business interests, it's a platform that's owned by the very photographers who distribute that content. And I think that's partly the model of the future, like moving towards those, you know, what is otherwise called a workers' co-op. You know, artists need to be also in charge of those platforms, I think.
I agree. We're definitely thinking of just, we're hoping to get into London Film Festival, and the producer that we're working with in America is trying to get us into Sundance, which would be brilliant. But post that, I think that we could just directly distribute, you know, but I don't know if people will pay money or not, because if you think about it, people are not used to paying to watch stuff. You know, they pay Netflix or they pay Amazon a monthly amount, and they get their films, and they also watch, you know, if I think about my own viewing habits at night, I'll watch like a series of crime dramas or something. Do you know what I mean? Like just get stuck into a box set. You know, and I don't know if there is a market or not for independent, you know, if you can really control that distribution, because the distributors are so big, the streamers are so big, aren't they? That I don't know, but we'll soon see. We can report back in another year and tell you.
So, is it between? So it sounds like that's so great to hear, Dan. You've got 1 million views on your trailer. But is it then, how do you then get that to a bigger audience, and then B, but also, unfortunately, keep coming back to how you're going to recoup your costs?
Yeah, the thing is with the way that we work on Facebook is that we put the film out there. We run video views you know, we've been running a video views campaign on the trailer for about a year or maybe 2 years, and then the people who watch 75% of that film, we retarget them with another, you know, with an ad of, like, say, the V&A woman coming to buy the collection or whatever, and then we try and drive them to our website where they start buying stuff. That's how it works for us. So if we didn't have banknotes or bond certificates or whatever to sell, we wouldn't be able to afford to get the trailer seen, because no one would allow us to, you know, Facebook or YouTube effectively try and kill your organic reach, you know, so you're fighting a war against them because they want your ad dollars. So that's why I was saying about the perversity of distribution and the perversity of, like, the position of effectively trying to get your story out there, because you're fighting an uphill battle from, like, moment one. And unless you create a marketing funnel for it, effectively, you won't get any you know. So I've had to, so there's the perverse reality. I've become like the Marxist marketer.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. But I would still reiterate, there's lots of movement happening around artist-owned distribution platforms. I do still think that the problem has been a kind of, well, not a lack of thinking, but maybe a lack of resources and focus being put on how we, instead of competing with Netflix or instead of pitching programs to Netflix, that we start our own Netflix, that we start our own video, and that actually those networks do exist across different mediums, and there's certainly lots of, I mean, if you look at anything to do with you know, the movement for Fairbnb, which is an Airbnb, but where people who rent or who provide housing also have ownership over that platform. So I think moving to those kind of, you know, worker co-op digital platforms is something that we should be thinking about, or we should be, artists need to be involved in those movements, I think, a lot more, because they're much more conducive to the kinds of value systems that that artists are more likely to support.
I think Charlie Chaplin was involved in setting up what was it, like one of those huge kind of distribution companies, you know, because he wanted to get artist ownership over the, you know, those films like years ago. And so this concept that artists should have a control of distribution, I think it's beautiful from our perspective. I haven't, I mean, and obviously it's worked in the past, but it's just to try and get to millions of people when you've got a message to do. You don't have time necessarily to try and build a platform as well as create the actual work.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's, and I mean, I guess I'm just pointing to the fact that it is that thinking and that kind of work is actually happening already. You know, there are attempts to create digital platforms that are artist owned, or worker owned. You know, doesn't have to be artist owned, it can just be worker owned.
So I've got a specific question here from my supervisor Noel on chat, and it's for Emma, and it's a very Australian question, but it's pertinent to the future of our cultural industry here, and that is, one proposal is to require streaming services to produce a percentage of local content. Emma, do you know where this communication policy is at? Netflix pay around 0.5% tax Australia.
Yeah, this is a subject close to my heart. Who asked that question? Because I love you, whoever you are. Just going to look in the chat. Thanks, Noel. Thanks.
As is Kim. So Noel.
So when I worked for Conroy, which is going back, 2007 to 2013. 2008 to 2013, I was responsible for pushing the Convergence Review, which was a review of, you know, media and screen regulation to try and cope with the oncoming influx of over-the-top platforms. And we proposed, or the panel proposed in that there be a requirement on international streaming services to produce a minimum amount of Australian content. Excuse me, Missy, I can't hear myself think. Take that outside, please. It's my daughter. And it didn't go anywhere because Labor couldn't keep its act together and hold on at the 2013 election notoriously. It's in front of the Parliament again, and certainly the commercial networks have long agitated for there to be what they call a level playing field, whereby international streaming services have similar local content obligations on them. They don't really care about that. What they want is to have their obligations lifted. And so their argument about a level playing field is a bit of a stalking horse. But the European Union has done it, right? There are requirements on international streaming services to produce in-language content. Now, the challenge that we have here is that is not seen as directly applicable to our market because we're an English-speaking market. And so the arguments they make about accessibility and the financial or economic imperatives of those streaming services to be able to broadcast programs in language rather than just subtitled American or British programs into those markets. There's a clear financial incentive for them there, where there isn't here because it's not a language barrier. But it is an essential cultural issue, and it is an essential issue about us telling our own stories and the kind of, the whole theoretical Benedict Anderson idea of the imagined community. We only understand one another by the stories that we tell. It's absolutely doable. And it's absolutely affordable for these massive streaming giants. And Australia per capita has the, no pun intended, has the highest uptake of Netflix outside the US. So, you know, it's a lucrative market for them. It just takes the political will to do it. And it's a tricky thing because politics and public service has been so dominated by economists for so long that if you can't make the economic argument, they'll dismiss it. And this is primarily a cultural argument. So, but it also has economic implications as well. So yes, my view is there should absolutely be a quota on international streaming services, on all streaming services, to produce original Australian content. And there will need to be some form of government subsidy or tax incentive to help them do that. Eventually what's going to happen is the audience for free-to-air television, particularly commercial free-to-air television, will collapse because no one's watching the ads anymore. And so those regulations need to be shifted onto new platforms. That's something we tried to do with the Convergence Review, but the forces in the media are just about, other than sort of like, you know, perhaps sport and the gambling lobby, they're the most powerful in Canberra, not only because of the money in that sector, but because if they get a policy outcome they don't like, they'll go you on the 6 o'clock news. And so politicians are scared of them. So it really will take kind of grassroots groundswell of people saying, we want to see our own stories on Australian TV. And the only area where that's really been successful is in kids' content, because parents hate when their kids are watching American shows, right? Bluey is the most downloaded program in iView history. It's more popular than Peppa Pig because people say this is an Australian story. But we need to extend that mentality beyond children's programming and recognise that those stories are valuable for all of us. And how we do that when the commercial networks are just producing crappy reality television, I don't know. But Australian scripted drama still performs really, really well when it's broadcast. So
it does. Yeah. Could I just offer something there? I agree with what you're saying. I think there is a trap with the term Australian content, though. Going back to the free trade agreement that Australia nutted out with the US, there was a campaign by the Australian Writers Guild and Screen Producers Association around Australian content. Yeah. They kind of got themselves into a bit of a cul-de-sac where people were running around trying to define what Australian was, where I think locally produced content or content, and this kind of comes to what Rebecca is talking about too, where content is put into the hands of local producers. I think that's more productive and there's more leeway, and you avoid some of the kind of the definitions of what Australian is. That would be my only observation. Yeah. I just had one question, and that was about the effect of the free trade agreement. My understanding of the free trade agreement back in, whenever it was, early noughties, America was more than happy to give us leeway on analog. But digital really narrowed us down to what we could and couldn't do. So does the free trade agreement come into play with this sort of proposal of requiring, you know, will America jump up and down within the framework of the free trade agreement and say, no, you can't do that?
There's long been dispute about that, Noel. So we would, when I worked with the minister, I was constantly told, the free trade agreement doesn't apply to digital streaming services, to digital multi-channel services, which was a very clever thing the US did. And at the time, the Howard government had no intention of funding digital television, right? So it doesn't apply to multi-channels. And we sought to extend it to multi-channels. And we got a little bit of something there, but not very much. But digital in the free trade agreement technically refers to digital broadcast multi-channels, not to over-the-top streaming services over the internet. There is the opportunity to revisit that. Yeah. But of course, America has such ridiculous power in these free trade, although maybe that's waning, in these free trade agreements that they tend to impose that. The other thing, of course, is that they allowed us to count New Zealand content as Australian content, which is problematic. So no, it's digital broadcast multi-channels, but the wording of the free trade agreement is it's not clear that that also applies to OTT or over-the-top streaming services.
Oh, thanks for that clarification. That's good. Yeah, thank you.
I'm on comfortable ground now, Nicole. This is my actual real area of expertise or knowledge.
No, that the revolution needs many dimensions. and we certainly need people with who understand how that dimension of bureaucracy and regulation works. And a lot of this is very hard to follow. You know, if you're just down here just trying to get messages out and do your thing, as most artists are. And as Dan used to do some stuff at Channel 4, didn't you? Like, you've got a bit of background there. So, but even you kind of coming up against, well, what next in this new era? But I'm seeing that Dan's just asked the question, Emma, when you said earlier about an era ending, which era were you thinking is coming to an end? 80 years ago was around the World War II. Do you think we'll move back towards a more Dickensian world or a more progressive time? I just want to say, living in London for the almost 7 years I did, it seemed to me it was heading back to a Dickensian time. I could see it on the street. You know, it was incredibly in place.
So I think I would prefer, if people aren't familiar with the work of Karl Polanyi, who's a eminent political economist and theorist from the mid-century, who really identified these kind of shifts in society. What we've seen in previous epochs is a time of relative equality, and then forces of power and of capital assert themselves and drive inequality, and then there's a populist backlash and things reset. And I think that's what we're seeing now. After World War II, we had the emergence of the welfare state. There was sort of 30 years of growing living standards, falling inequality, the rise of the middle class, and the just sort of destruction of the kind of serfdom aristocracy model in Europe. And then capital reasserted itself in the 70s, and now we've got to the point again where the tensions are so great that the great unwashed, as we're all known, are revolting, and some of us are revolting, particularly those that are, in the sort of far right movements in the US and Europe. But they will either turn, and this is the genius of Polanyi's work, when the social contract fails to lift the majority of people up and becomes corrupted to the extent at which there is a capitalist class and the rest of us, then the people will revolt. And they will either revolt by turning to right-wing demagogues, as has happened in previous eras and seems to be happening now with Brexit and Trump and other, and I would suggest here as well in a much more subtle but invidious way with our current government, or they can revolt by rediscovering their solidarity across the boundaries of class and culture and race and gender, and reasserting the primacy of the solidarity of the people. So it's about the choices we make, and if we don't actively collectivise and use our strength of numbers, because there are a lot more of us than there are of them, then we will enter an era where we potentially have the kind of return to fascism that we saw, in the 1930s and 40s, and then there's a massive bloody correction rather than a peaceful revolution. So it could go either way, but it's up to all of us, and we all have a stake in determining which way we want to go and what we want to fight for.
So that leads me to, I can see that we're starting to run towards the end of this session. I had to keep going, but it was going to end at 7:30, although it did take a while to kick off. I'm still a bit sad for the people who were kept out by the capitalist conspiracy that turned out to be Eventbrite's dodgy event linked to this. So what next? I mean, is there, so one humble idea I had was, is there any way we could get, because there is, as you said, Emma, as Rebecca has indicated as well, I mean, it's not an I, it's a we. And the only way forward with any of these progressive ideas, which are not going to be warmly embraced by some of the major media outlets, who are the arbiters of the storytelling, the major storytelling that a lot of people get nowadays. Is there any possibility, do you think, of artists from different disciplines across Australia, small and large, individual arts workers, but also symphony orchestras, chamber orchestras, theatre groups, writers of more or less success, banding together to start coming up with stories that are about the economic issues that are facing us right now, and trying to critique some of the other stories which are being rained down on us all the time from a neoliberal storyteller. Is there any way that we could actually work together across disciplines and across the nation to come up with a range of different interventions, artworks across our platforms to critique that and hopefully illuminate and educate?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, and I have to remember not to feel cynical and jaded about this very question, because it comes up, you know. And I have to say that part of the last 5 years I've spent in Europe and the States, and it might be a population thing, it could be a density issue. I think it's all of the things to do with, you know, the last 40 years of neoliberalism and the kind of, you know, white Australia has a black history and has a black future. It's colonization, it's all that stuff that contributes to a fairly kind of benign maliciousness. Like Australia has a very, and I think the arts community reflects that as well. So on my better days, I would say, yes, Nicole, absolutely, artists working together. And we have variously come together across the sector, particularly around the funding cuts, you know, particularly around the Brandis raid. And you saw what happened, the consequence. We got kneecapped, right? The small to medium sector, because all the big end of town in the funding and Australia Council, all the major performing arts, so the key organisations are quarantined from funding cuts. So when Brandis did that cut and he took that money and put it into that ridiculous, you know, Arts Excellent Fund, which was just the biggest waste of time. And then, of course, eventually a portion of the money got returned, and, you know, half of it was missing, and it had been such a morale destroying exercise for the arts. But that was very definitely an attack in response to the boycott of the Sydney Biennale, which happened because of the, if anyone doesn't know, in 2014, the Sydney Biennale, Transfield, which was the founding organisation of the Biennale, the family that run that company, accepted an $80 billion contract from the Australian government to run the detention centres, the offshore detention centres.
I didn't know that.
Oh, this was big. So we led a boycott campaign to boycott the Biennale, and many international artists pulled out. Transfield were forced to basically decide, were they in the industry of celebrating art or in factories of human misery. And so, you know, they did have to stand down. The Transfield, the director of the company had to get off the board, and the artists, independent artists, that's who led the boycott, with refugee-led activist groups. You know, the kind of language that was used to describe, I think Malcolm Turnbull called us ingrates. I think he actually used that word. He described us as, you know, that we were malicious ingrates, that we didn't, and then Brandis tried to write into the Australia Council funding agreements that in the future, if you accept Australian Arts Council funding money and you refuse commercial funding based on a political idea or whatever, that you automatically forfeit your access to Australian Council funding money. Now, he wasn't able to do that because of the constitution of the Australia Council meant that he would have to move an act to Parliament in order to change that within the Australia Council. And he couldn't do that, so instead he just kneecapped the sector, which is why we had that massive 46% cut into our funding, the pool of money available to us. And so, you know, yes, artists mobilized around that, but I have to say, like, there is a very conservative kind of thread in the arts in Australia. And that's not to say there hasn't been an amazing, very radical history, particularly around workers' theatre and around community theatre and arts, visual arts activism. But there is something about the kind of slow boiling frog kind of movement that's been happening in the arts in Australia, and the extreme hostility combined with the outrageous housing affordability issue, which has driven a lot of artists either out of the cities, and it's fractured our communities, and it's really kind of hemorrhaged a lot of contact and a lot of connection and a lot of that potential for organizing in communities. I mean, whole neighborhoods were, constantly, moved on, so that fragmentation of communities, it takes a lot, I think, for an arts community to kind of reconfigure and gather together again. And I think we lose a lot of resources in the process. And then a lot of artists have actually left Australia, because it's so hostile here. It's so ideologically hostile here.
Can I pick up on what you're saying there, Rebecca?
Yeah.
Really excellent points, and that example of what happened with the Biennale and Brandis's reaction and the kind of deliberately vindictive and punitive.
It was very deliberate, and it was vindictive. Yeah.
So one of the things that I find really difficult in my engagement with the public is sort of the unwillingness of a lot of the gatekeepers of public debate to acknowledge that actually the Liberal Party has become deeply illiberal in recent years. There's nothing liberal about it anymore. So a lot of the supporters of the arts in Australia are what we call small L liberals, right? They vote Liberal, but they've got strong cultural concerns. They donate to the arts. They attend the opera. And that's why that big end of town in the arts sector is still powerful. But they are no longer a Liberal Party. They are a deeply conservative party, and they are almost like a Tea Party version of what was the Liberal Party here. And so, to end on a probably unpopular note, I'm gonna do something that I do regularly, and it often gets me in trouble, which is to ask people on the left like ourselves, people that are genuinely progressive and that care about the arts and care about the public sector, to stop buying into this narrative that there's no difference between the major parties, because there is. Labor's far from perfect. It's far from perfect, and there are people like Joel Fitzgibbon, right? Don't get me started. But there is a significant difference between the two parties. And as long as we keep squabbling amongst ourselves, and I think what happened at the last election was many activists on the left, from the refugee movement, from the environmental movement, from other movements, were already treating Labor as though they were in government and focusing their criticisms on Labor. And so we're divided on the left. And they're the only realistic party of government in at least the next 10 to 15 years, right, on the left. Whereas the right are constantly united, just as we've seen with Donald Trump. They don't care how crazy he is, he's their guy. If we're going to change things in this country and stop us going down a really extreme right-wing path, we have to hold our noses with the things that we're unhappy with the Labor Party and get them into government, and then we have to change things from within. But as long as any of us buy into this idea that there's no difference, they're as bad as each other, lib, lab, all the old parties are the same, we are going to end up with a complete, an irretrievable move to the right. And that was exemplified by Brandis, because he was meant to be one of the smaller liberals in the party, right? And he completely betrayed that. So that might be an unpopular thing to say, but I've never been unafraid of saying unpopular things, because
it's contentious.
More than anything, we have to get this mob out of power.
And for the benefit of our UK friends, there is a very different voting system in Australia than there is in the UK. So it's not first past the post. We do have proportional representation. We do have, votes distributed according to preferential voting in the lower house. And on this, I think this forum is to get everything on the table and to have the debates that need to be had. And there's no censorship at all. So thank you for contributing that. Emma, I will say though, I'm going to go down the party. I was a member of the Labor Party for a long time, but I moved to the Greens. And I do think the Greens have been a very positive and progressive influence on electoral politics. But I also think we've helped support people like you within the Labor Party to hear you know, there's a need for people with the like-minded thinking and want to see interventions that support the right policies. And you can badge yourself for different parties, but you can.
There's not a lot of difference
I think
between left.
I think it's about supporting the right policies and supporting the right people.
Yeah, but I agree with a lot of Greens policies, and there's not a lot of difference between, you know, the left of Labor, where I would position myself, and the Greens, other than I would say perhaps a lack of class politics, and I'm a bit old-fashioned like that. But effectively, the Greens have, you know, they've been in existence now for 35 years. They've never cracked more than 10% of the vote and one lower house seat. If we want a change of government, vote Greens, that's fine, but preference Labor, and make sure that you're not like voting Green in a seat that Labor could hold, because a coalition's not going to happen anytime soon. So I'm not going to tell people how to vote. A lot of my friends vote Green, and a lot of them vote Labor. One of them votes Liberal, but I've been friends with her since she was 5, so there's not much.
I don't want this to get into party politics, because one of the things that Greens would say is that, and I think all of us here would
abolish the parliament.
Is that kind of tribalism, party politics? We don't have time for it now. You know, we need to.
I think it's
beyond a machine politics.
Yeah, all I'm saying is
I think the horizon for party politics is over. I think that we're looking at we're not even deep in the Anthropocene, era, but things are going to fundamentally, radically change within 10 years from now, whether we think voting Green or voting Labor is going to make a change. We need radical solutions. And I don't think what we call representative democracy, parliamentary democracy, is going to deliver that. It's just not. We need so many radical changes. And I think the role of artists is to really start agitating and start thinking about even looking at local council committees, or looking at the way in which our local democracy is being delivered. There are so many different ways to do that kind of deliberative democracy, or looking at municipalities as kind of, interesting nodes within a more kind of federated system. I think we don't use technology enough to talk about democracy. And I think there are more important fundamental things like, acknowledging stolen land, reparations. I think these are the kind of more fundamental root issues over and above whether we vote Labor or the Greens.
And certainly,
that's a controversial opinion for me.
No, Rebecca, that wasn't, I certainly wasn't trying to tell people how to vote. What I was saying was we can't buy into this cynicism that they're all the same, because they're not. There are clear benefits in having a Labor government than having a Liberal government. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we've got now. So that's all I was trying to say with that. And I do have to go. I'm a 6-year-old waiting for dinner, but I do still believe in representative democracy. And while I agree with you that eventually things will evolve, I don't have time to wait for that. The next 3 years, if we have another term of a Conservative government, for a child, that's their lifetime, and it can set their life back. So we can't hold on for the perfect. We have to aim for the perfect long term, but incremental change is equally important. And this is why, ultimately I was an Elizabeth Warren supporter in the US primaries, but ultimately when it came down to it, I would have voted for Biden over Bernie, because Biden's got a chance of winning, and we've got to get rid of Trump. It is that transactional at a basic day-to-day level. And so you have to have your eye on the immediate, but never lose sight of that big picture, where I think you're right, we can get to better forms of society over the long term. But,
yes, just to wind up now, I do actually find myself agreeing with you, Emma, and Rebecca as well on this. And my supervisors will be relieved to know I actually turned back being pushed to be a local councillor here for the Greens. But the nice thing about local politics here, at least, is that people don't actually necessarily align with parties. They might be members of parties, but they're there to do the right thing by their constituents. So that's what we all want. Local, think local, and the other way around is think global, act local. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm so sorry that other people didn't get to enjoy this, but I will send out a link to, what am I saying now? I think I'll send out a link to this, the correct Zoom link, and apologise for the strange problems with Eventbrite, and see what we can do possibly in the future if anyone's interested.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
No one makes anything here except money.